So the calling is wrapped up in Phuket as well as the battle hardened, and spoiler alert, both were won not by Dromi but instead by Aelia. And we're about to start ProQuest season, and Dromi is probably going to exit in week 1. So what does this mean for the Flesh and Blood metagame? Let's talk about it. And I thought the only real way to kind of break this down cleanly while you can follow along with me is in tier list form, because tier lists are the way we communicate as a society now on the internet. At least that's what I've been told. So tier list time. First of all, notice how this is not based on like overall power level. This is how these heroes, in my opinion, are going to shape up going into this next season that we are in a ProQuest season. Do I think that they're going to be red hot, going way up in the meta? Do I think that they're just on the rise? Are they standing pat where they have been? Are they on the way down, or are they sort of all the way down but not out? And I think we need to start with Aelia, because Aelia is looking quite red hot after this past weekend. Aelia is one of those heroes that is already really good and has the capacity to just do nasty nuts kinds of things with her on-hit effects. And well, it's proven that she can do those things because she picked up wins at both the calling as well as also on the battle hardened this past weekend, which is it is kind of why she deserves this sort of top spot on the rise. She sort of grew to be this natural counter to KO, and in doing so, without sort of her own disruption, if you're not disrupting her, she's just outputting massive amounts of damage. She's also seeing a boon from the fact that Dromi is not going to be here for much longer. And it begs the question, should we even put Dromi on this list? Here's what I'll do. I'll put Dromi in the solid tier simply because she's going to be making her way out of the format. And it leads us to the question of what happens to the format when she rotates out. If heroes like Aelia that have been pushed down start to kind of rise to the top, or have the capacity to rise to the top, what does it mean for other heroes in the format? Well, if Dromi leaves, what heroes were there and existing and pretty good into Dromi that may be missing her as a primary matchup? And you could be looking at something like a Katsu. Katsu may not be as prevalent because he had the capacity to prey on Dromi. The same thing could perhaps be said about Fi. And technically, Katsu and Fi both being ninjas, but really Katsu, with the fact that on-hit effects are very easy to push over when a hero can only block 2, which is kind of in a lot of respects what something like Aelia can do, and something like a KO, which is also very well represented, can do if you're putting a lot of the 2 blocks in or the 0 blocks. You could still argue that he still has a capacity to be in the meta, and that is what I would argue. I would argue that he's pretty solid overall, and then maybe even can push into the on the rise category. But if Dromi leaves, he loses a great matchup, and he has to make that up into a variety of other heroes. Another hero we should definitely talk about is Dorinthia. Dorinthia, in my opinion, is definitely on the rise. Basically, the Pro Tour cemented her place towards the top of the tier lists, as they ring out into the world. And you might just straight up argue that she is red hot right now as well. Just being a consistent, steady mid-range / control build means that she has the capacity to go toe-to-toe with just about every hero in the game. And to be completely honest, I would say the exact same thing about Kasai, specifically more when Dromi rotates. Both Kasai and Dorinthia, and perhaps you can put them both on the same tier, but I'm respecting the Dorinthia results from the Pro Tour. Kasai has the same ability to kind of do what Dorinthia can with axes, can also in some cases do what she does with sabers, but mainly the Decimator and the axe builds I think give Dorinthia an edge over Kasai. Nevertheless, I do think Kasai is on the rise, because the natural next step to a hero like Dromi rotating and some of these heroes losing some equity in the meta is that a lot of heroes will start to pivot towards a more mid-range build, because mid-range is not being punished by the Dromi board state anymore. And that means that, I don't know, the queen, if you will, of mid-range in Kasai and Dorinthia can really kind of test their mettle against everybody else. KO is another hero that we should talk about. KO being a hero that I would actually argue is slipping a little bit. Now, this is the time to remind you that this tier list is not a tier list based on relative power level. The heroes up here are not the most powerful heroes in the format. They are just gaining the most. Heroes down here are not the weakest in the format. They are just slipping more than others. And KO, in my opinion, is slipping a little bit in the meta. I think as we pivot into a more mid-range defensive kind of meta game into ProQuest season before the release of the next set, KO might lose some overall percentage points into matchups simply because he can't output damage in the same way that some other heroes can, and he can oftentimes be blocked out in some respects. And so I wonder if KO goes a more mid-range route himself, or if people just try to go like ham and just include all copies of all big attacks. I mean, we're already seeing people playing like the standard list of like all wild rides and you know, swing bigs. Of course, that's a fantastic card, and the bear fangs and things like that, which are non-block cards and are included because they are spikes and power level. We saw people trying to pivot away from the use of cast bones. Do they just slam all cast bones and try to like spike opponents, or are we going to play a much more measured like Rhinar type game plan into the format? I'm curious to see if he just has better numbers completely and he starts just winning all the ProQuests, or if he comes down a little bit and ProQuests get evenly spread with like Dorinthia and Aelia hating on him with on-hit effects, and like Kasai and so on and so forth. And that also brings me to Victor. I think Victor will be on the rise because he has the capacity to play a more aggro mid-range game plan, being a solid Guardian with some really kind of nutty cards. Like Test of Strength is just kind of a nutty card, and it allows him to both be very defensive and conscientious of his own life, while also just pushing massive damage off of the back of big attacks turn after turn after turn. It's kind of cool how he can play this mid-range aggressive like version of Guardian in a way that Bravo kind of hints at and does in some big moments, but at the same time, like there's a little bit of brittleness in the way Bravo goes about it, and I feel like Victor's a lot more locked in on it. Couple that with the fact that I personally believed that the Dromi versus Victor matchup was Dromi favored. I think Victor gains a lot on the loss of the bad matchup that is Dromi. As we rotate back into talking about how Dromi's moving out, I think all of the assassins go up. Every single assassin is, in my opinion, now a little bit better, which I think is very cool. And then we'll throw, of course, the third assassin when she releases in new after the rotation of Dromi. A board state of dragons is hard for assassins to deal with. Even though they have daggers, it's hard for them to deal with consistently because Rake the Embers is a card. And because of that, we have some movement, certainly. And again, if everyone's playing a more defensive fatigue strategy, or I wouldn't even say fatigue, a more mid-range strategy, I think there's some capacity for both Azuri and Arachne to compete in that meta. One of the biggest meta stories from the Pro Tour was Viscer. Viscer making it to like some pretty high top spots off of the back of just an aggressive plan. People were playing the more aggressive version. I will say this though, as Dromi rotates and people see Aelia doing well and even Viscer start to show up, the second layer of this metagame is people including Warmonger's Diplomacy in their decks, and I'll be honest with you, if that's the case, then I don't love Viscer's chances. Again, that is like a card that single-handedly hated Viscer out of the format, basically. That coupled with that there were just better aggro decks. And if that's the case, then I'm not too comfortable with his position. I will say the caveat to this that could move him into this is if everyone starts running the OTK build. Because if everyone's running that build, then Warmonger's Diplomacy basically just becomes a silver bullet when they want to go off on their OTK turn. Even then, they can still just play the attack and not build even more rune chants on that turn. But if you were looking to pick up the more aggressive version of Viscer, I would worry because this hero right here makes everybody play Warmonger's Diplomacy again. And I know people are like gonna play Warmonger's Diplomacy again, but I'm not using that to justify moving Aelia down. She's still way too hot. We should talk about Betsy. I know people don't want to talk about Betsy, but sadly, I do think Betsy is one of those heroes that falls in the sort of just continues to slip down and down and down. There's almost no reason to pick her up simply because Victor and to some degree Bravo exist. They kind of do aspects of what she does just better. And the only reason to kind of play her is if you, well, what is the reason to play her? Like, why play Betsy? I don't know. Answer that in a comment below. If you know why I should play Betsy or someone should play Betsy, let me know that in a comment below. I want to fill in a couple of these at rapid fire speed now. I think Boltyn is still just sitting solid. By the way, I'm not putting these in any particular order. I think Boltyn's actually in a fine spot. I'm not sure he gains just a ton. Technically, losing the Dromi matchup is pretty decent, I think. Every time I played as Dromi into Boltyn, I felt very comfortable. But perhaps that's just because of the quality of Boltyn player I played into. I don't know, perhaps. Nevertheless, I do think he stays pretty solid, and I think he's in a pretty good spot. I don't think he's gaining a ton of equity, but I also don't think he's losing any, and I think he's just sitting pretty overall. Viscer, to me, continues to slip because while she can throw big attacks, I don't think she does much in the face of like disruption and on-hit effects. And I've never felt particularly threatened by Vinsets that don't absolutely just pop off. And there's not a ton of reason to drop her down into that format outside of the fact that you can just pop off. And there's a lot of heroes that have the capacity to pop off. Someone like a Kano. If Kano loses the Dromi matchup, does he get better? Yes, he does. He does indeed get better. And as a Kano player, looking at these heroes that are also on the rise does not necessarily scare me from the Kano perspective. So as of right now, I'm feeling pretty good about Kano's chances in the overall format. And I do expect a lot of people to maybe sideboard in more Oasis Respites, but I think he has a lot of game going forward into the meta. Bravo feels very solid. He's still just doing Bravo things. Levia feels very solid. She's doing Levia things. Again, these are in no particular order, and they are not based on power level. I think Levia is quite powerful, but I don't expect that many more people to pick her up and like eat up the meta share of, you know, ProQuest season. If they're not playing Levia already, I don't think they're going to go, okay, let me pick a new hero, and it's Levia. Because she's just really complicated, and she can kill herself, which is dangerous, so I don't recommend that. But I do think that the power is there. I would say Riptide is slightly favored compared to where he used to be, simply because he's losing the Dromi matchup, and he's a pretty solid hero overall into most of these decks. There's just not a lot of people trying him because they look at him as like a poor hero in general, like a poor quality hero. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, though you could argue that with Aelia just being the better ranger, maybe no one picks him up. That being said, I do think his stock is on the rise. Olympia, unfortunately, feels like he's pretty down but not out. There's no real reason to run him out there. Yes, he's gaining some technically they're both gaining some, but I don't feel like he's gaining that much for him to not be really just kind of falling by the wayside in a lot of respects. Slab dash and mid-range dash continues to just be exactly here, which is hilarious because dash I feel like is always here. Though I will say dash IO seems to be on the rise as of right now. One of the only true full aggro decks, perhaps besides Fi, KO, and Katsu. She feels like one of the only, and maybe you can argue Kano. She feels like one of the only, and I should say, Aelia. She feels like one of the only ones that's basically just hair on fire, as just a general rule. And weirdly enough, though, I did play against someone who was playing like a slab dash version of a dash IO. Nevertheless, I think she is all but kind of cemented herself as an aggro hero, and she lives kind of there. But I do think that she has been picking up in popularity from what I've seen as far as online play and people starting to pick her up. But if we're kind of tossing that out as anecdotal, then she would probably just be sitting here in the solid tier. I will say I don't think Max is gaining that much. I mean, he's the fundamental issue with Max is that his combo is slower and more easily disrupted via a lot of these heroes, and therefore I think he continues to slip, especially if some of these heroes do indeed get better. I think Prism right now is starting to heat up, but I don't necessarily think that many people are going to flock to her. That being said, it's pretty clear in the meta that she's gaining in popularity and gaining in skill. You could argue that she's gaining enough to go up to here and that people are going to start like really committing, but I personally don't buy it. So I'm going to put her here. Rhinar is a super solid, like the quintessential solid. And then we get to the Tech Levasan ? I feel as though he has to belong down here because he continues to slip until he has any way, shape, or form to compete with like the Kanos of the world. Though maybe he's good enough now that like this meta starts to rotate away from board states. Maybe he's good enough now to make it into the solid tier. Personally, I don't see it. So this is where I see people trending towards. If you wanted to balance it out, you can move your Kasai up. You could maybe argue moving like Victor. Personally, I think this is totally fine. This to me feels like where heroes are trending upwards and downwards, but let me know what you think in a comment below. Are you of the opinion that these heroes are like really on the rise in the meta? Do you think ProQuest season is going to be full of these heroes up here? Let me know what you think in a comment below. If you enjoy videos like this where I do tier lists because tier lists exist, let me know that as well, and press a button to make it go slightly higher because numbers going up, that's what we do here. That's what we do here. Straight up. That's what we do here. So press subscribe and then a little like the like button, it lights up. It's pretty awesome. As always, thanks for watching.